The envelope trembled in John Harmon's weathered hands, his mechanic's eyes catching what others might miss, the signature that wasn't quite right. 43 years of marriage had taught him the rhythm of Margaret's handwriting, like he knew the sound of a misaligned engine. Now, sitting in his den where grandchildren once played at his feet, that knowledge turned the world cold. The familiar tick of the grandfather clock marked seconds as tears gathered, blurring the words that claimed his wife was leaving, taking everything they'd built together. The coffee beside him grew cold, its aroma mixing with the scent of betrayal as he traced a finger across their last Christmas photo. Something wasn't right. The Margaret who'd kissed him goodbye yesterday morning, who'd planned their garden expansion last week, wouldn't forge this letter? As the first tear fell, splashing onto the signature and causing the ink to bloom slightly at the edge, John felt something beyond grief stir within him. Suspicion. Ever had your world shattered by someone you trusted completely? Share your story below, like if this strikes a familiar chord, and follow along to discover how a man society dismissed as just an old mechanic uses a lifetime of wisdom to uncover a conspiracy that threatens everything he loves. The evening light slanted through the curtains, casting long shadows across John's den. His fingers trembled as he held the letter, its cream-colored paper incongruent with the weight it carried. 67 years had etched lines across his face, but none as deep as what formed now as his eyes traced the signature at the bottom. Not Margaret. Can't be. The floorboards creaked beneath him as he sank into his armchair, the one he'd reupholstered himself 3 summers ago. The faint aroma of coffee lingered from his afternoon cup, now cold and forgotten on the side table. Dust motes danced in the fading light, illuminating a space where grandchildren once tumbled and squealed while he watched from this very spot. The clock on the mantel ticked with maddening precision, marking seconds that suddenly felt too precious. "This ain't right," he whispered, voice catching on the words. His gaze drifted to the family photo on the bookshelf. Last Christmas, all smiles and matching sweaters. Margaret standing beside him, her hand on his shoulder. The same hand that supposedly penned this letter. Tears welled, blurring the words that made less sense with each reading. In 43 years of marriage, he'd fixed everything from leaky faucets to broken hearts. But this felt beyond repair. Something cold and heavy settled in his chest as the first tear broke free, sliding down his weathered cheek. His hand pressed against his heart as if to hold it together. The old mechanic in him wanted to diagnose, to find the loose part and tighten it back into place. But people weren't engines. Trust, once cracked, couldn't be soldered back together with a steady flame and some flux. He shook his head slowly, denying what sat plain as day on the paper before him. "How could you, darlin', all these years?" Another tear fell, landing on the signature, causing the ink to bloom slightly at the edge. The salt of his tears mixed with the bitter taste of betrayal as he clutched the photo frame with his free hand. His thumb traced the edge of Margaret's smile, a smile he thought he knew. The room seemed to contract around him, the familiar space suddenly foreign. The ticking clock, the creaking chair, the scent of old books and motor oil. Constance in a world suddenly tilted off its axis. As his tears subsided, something caught his eye. A smudge on the letter, right where Margaret's signature ended. Something wasn't right about the flow of the ink. After decades of signing repair orders and invoices, John's eyes knew the rhythm of a genuine signature. His brow furrowed as suspicion sparked through the fog of grief. He blinked away tears, focusing on the anomaly with the precision that had made him the most trusted mechanic in the county. A knock at the door startled him from his scrutiny. 3 soft raps, hesitant. John's head lifted, his steps faltering as he rose, letter still clutched in his hand. Friend or foe? The question hung in the air as he moved toward the sound, uncertainty in every step. John wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, tucking the letter into his shirt pocket as he moved toward the door. The knock came again, more insistent this time. He hesitated, gathering himself, straightening shoulders that suddenly felt heavier than his toolbox after a long day's work. When he opened the door, the porch stood empty. Only the evening breeze stirred the wind chimes Margaret had hung last spring. Someone's playing games now. His jaw tightened as he scanned the darkening yard, noting nothing but shadows and the neighbor's cat slinking along the fence line. Back in the den, the walls seemed to press closer. The same room where he'd taught his grandson to tie fishing knots now felt like a witness to something gone terribly wrong. John reached for the phone, his fingers hovering over the keypad before dialing a number he rarely used. Robert speaking? The voice on the other end sounded distracted, the background noise suggesting a restaurant or bar. "Bobby, it's John." He tried to keep his voice steady, but something in it must have betrayed him. "Uncle John? Everything okay?" Robert's tone shifted instantly, the background noise fading as he presumably moved somewhere quieter. "Not rightly sure." John sank back into his armchair, avoiding looking at the family photo that now seemed to mock him from the shelf. "Got a letter here, supposedly from your Aunt Margaret. Thing is, doesn't feel right." A pause stretched between them, too long for comfort. "What kind of letter?" Robert finally asked, his voice carefully neutral in a way that made the hair on John's neck stand up. "Says she's—" John's voice cracked. He cleared his throat, started again. "Says she's meeting with lawyers tomorrow about the house." The family home, built by his own hands over 2 summers while Margaret was pregnant with their daughter. The home where Robert himself had spent countless weekends as a child when his own parents' marriage was falling apart. Another pause. "Uncle John, Robert's voice trailed off. "Maybe I should come by. You know something, boy?" The mechanic's directness cut through the hesitation. "I just think we should talk in person." John's grip tightened on the receiver as he recalled the family barbecue last month. How Robert had huddled with Margaret near the garden, their conversation stopping abruptly when John approached with fresh drinks. How Robert had avoided his eyes for the rest of the afternoon. Fine. The word came out harder than intended. "When?" "I'll be there in an hour." After hanging up, John pulled the letter out again. The evening light had faded, forcing him to switch on the lamp beside his chair. The sudden brightness illuminated the signature more clearly, the familiar loops of Margaret's handwriting, yet not quite right, like someone trying too hard to duplicate something they'd seen but never produced themselves. He opened the drawer of the side table, reaching past old birthday cards and warranty papers to the back where a small notebook lay hidden beneath a false bottom, a trick from his Navy days. Inside were the documents he'd never thought he'd need: account numbers, passwords, the deed to the house in both their names. The lock on the drawer stuck slightly as he pushed it closed. John paused, noticing something he hadn't before: scratch marks around the keyhole, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. Someone had been in his drawer. John stared at the scratches around the keyhole, a cold certainty settling in his stomach. 40 years fixing engines had taught him to recognize the difference between normal wear and deliberate tampering. These marks were fresh. Someone had jimmied the lock recently. He pulled the drawer open again, this time examining its contents more carefully. Everything looked to be in place, but something felt off. The arrangement wasn't quite how he kept things. John had always been methodical, a place for everything and everything in its place. Margaret used to tease him about it. "Even your junk drawer has a filing system," she'd say with that smile that still warmed him after all these decades. The thought of her brought a fresh wave of confusion. 43 years together, and not once had he questioned her honesty. Now, sitting in the growing darkness of evening, doubt crept in like the autumn chill through poorly sealed windows. Rising from his chair, John moved to the garden window. The backyard lay in shadow, but he could still make out the bench where they'd sit on summer evenings, where she'd laid her head on his shoulder just last week, talking about their granddaughter's college plans. Had there been something in her voice then? Some hint he'd missed? "Don't go borrowing trouble, old man," he muttered to himself, breath fogging the glass slightly. Yet the letter in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest, demanding attention. He turned away from the window and crossed to the bookshelf, pulling down the family Bible where they kept important papers. Flipping through to the back, he found the envelope containing their will, their insurance policies, the deed to the house. All seemed in order, until he noticed the corner of another document peeking out from behind the others. With fingers that suddenly felt too thick and clumsy, John extracted the paper. A bank statement he didn't recognize. An account in Margaret's name alone, with a balance that made his breath catch. Where had that kind of money come from? And why didn't he know about it? The front doorbell rang, startling him so badly he nearly dropped the statement. Robert. John quickly returned the paper to its hiding place, closed the Bible, and set it back on the shelf. His heart hammered against his ribs as he moved toward the door, pausing to glance at himself in the hallway mirror. The face that looked back seemed older somehow, the lines deeper, the eyes shadowed with something he didn't want to name. As he reached for the doorknob, a floorboard creaked behind him from the direction of the kitchen. John froze, listening intently. The house settled around him, familiar sounds of an old structure that he'd learned to interpret over decades. But this wasn't the house settling. This was a footstep. Someone else was in the house. His hand hovered over the doorknob as the bell rang again. Outside stood Robert, likely with answers to questions John was only beginning to formulate. Inside lurked someone who didn't want those questions asked at all. John's jaw set as he made his decision. With deliberate quietness, he turned away from the front door and moved toward the kitchen, following the sound that shouldn't be there. The kitchen lay in shadows, moonlight slanting through the window above the sink where Margaret had placed a row of small potted herbs. John moved silently, a skill he'd learned during his Navy years and never quite lost. His hand found the drawer where they kept a flashlight, but he hesitated. Light would give away his position. A soft, scraping sound came from the pantry. John inched closer, pulse thrumming in his ears. The doorbell rang again, more insistent now, but he ignored it. Robert could wait. This couldn't. The pantry door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of movement visible through the crack. John took a deep breath, counting silently as he'd taught himself to do in moments of stress. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. On 3, he yanked the door open. Jesus Christ! A young woman stumbled backward, colliding with shelves of canned goods. A jar of peaches crashed to the floor, shattering in a mess of syrupy fruit and glass. John reached for the light switch, flooding the space with harsh fluorescence. He recognized her immediately. Lisa, Margaret's personal assistant from the foundation. Early 30s, sleek brown hair now disheveled, designer clothes that always seemed too expensive for her position. "Mr. Harmon!" she gasped, regaining her balance. "I can explain." "You'd best start then," John said, crossing his arms over his chest, blocking the exit. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "Beginning with why you're in my pantry when nobody let you in." Lisa's eyes darted past him toward the kitchen door. "Is Margaret here?" "You know damn well she isn't." The pieces were starting to align in John's mind, forming a picture he didn't want to see. "The letter? Was it you?" Color drained from Lisa's face. She straightened, something shifting in her demeanor. "Mr. Harmon, I think you should call Mrs. Harmon. There are things you don't understand." "Seems there's a lot I don't understand lately." John's gaze hardened. "Like why my wife's assistant is breaking into my house. Or why there's an account with more money than a retired school teacher should have. Or why my nephew sounds like he's walking on eggshells, talking to his own uncle." The persistent doorbell had stopped, now came pounding, Robert's voice calling through the door. "Uncle John, open up!" Lisa used John's momentary distraction to try slipping past, but his reflexes hadn't dulled with age. He caught her arm, firm but not rough. "Not so fast." "You're making a mistake," she hissed, attempting to twist free. "You have no idea what's happening." "Then enlighten me." John's patience was wearing thin, a lifetime of measured calm fraying at the edges. Lisa's expression changed, calculation replacing fear. "Fine. Your wife is leaving you, Mr. Harmon. She's been planning it for months, that money. She's been skimming from your accounts and the foundation. The house will be sold from under you by next week." Her lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "She sent me for the final documents tonight." The words hit John like physical blows, each one landing with precision. 43 years of marriage. The foundation they'd built together after retirement, using his savings and her organizational skills to help underprivileged kids learn trade skills. Their home constructed with his own hands. All of it a lie. "You're lying," he said. But doubt had taken root, growing with each revelation. The pounding at the front door grew louder. A crash indicated Robert had moved to the window. "Am I?" Lisa pulled something from her jacket pocket, a phone. "She recorded this for you, said it might be easier than facing you." She pressed play, holding it up. Margaret's voice filled the kitchen. "John, I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far." The familiar voice continued, detailing grievances and resentments John had never suspected, plans he'd never been privy to. The world tilted beneath his feet. A roaring filled his ears, drowning out the latter part of the message. The only clear thought in the chaos of his mind was how wrong her voice sounded, the cadence off, the tone artificial. Then it hit him, the same wrongness he'd noticed in the signature. "That's not Margaret," he said quietly, certainty blooming even as Robert finally managed to force the window and clamber through, landing in the living room with a thud. "I don't know what game you're playing, but that's not my wife's voice." Lisa's composure slipped, just for a second, but long enough for John to see the truth. This wasn't about a failing marriage or embezzled funds. This was something far worse. "Uncle John!" Robert burst into the kitchen, breathing hard, eyes widening at the scene before him. John gripping Lisa's arm, broken glass glittering among spilled peaches on the floor. "What the hell is going on?" John didn't loosen his hold on Lisa. "Your aunt's assistant here broke into our house. Claims Margaret's stealing money and leaving me." His voice remained steady despite the tremor in his chest. "Played me a recording that's supposed to be Margaret." Robert's expression shifted. something unreadable flickering across his features. "Lisa, what are you doing here?" The familiarity in his tone wasn't lost on John. "You two know each other outside the foundation?" A moment of silent communication passed between Robert and Lisa, confirming John's suspicion. His nephew, his sister's only child, the boy who'd spent summers learning to fish and fix engines in this very house, was somehow part of whatever this was. "Uncle John," Robert approached slowly, hands raised as if calming a spooked animal. "You need to let Lisa go. There are things happening. Complicated things. Aunt Margaret wanted to tell you herself. So you keep saying." John released Lisa, but positioned himself between her and the door. "Seems everyone knows what's happening with my wife except me." Lisa rubbed her arm where he'd held her, composure fully restored. "Mr. Harmon, your wife has been moving assets for months. Ask yourself why. Ask yourself where she is right now, when she told you she was visiting her sister. Claudia's in the hospital. Margaret's helping with the kids." The defense came automatically, but even as the words left his mouth, doubt crept in. He hadn't actually spoken to Claudia recently, hadn't verified. "Call her," Lisa challenged, a triumphant gleam in her eye. "Call Claudia right now." John pulled out his cell phone, the same basic model he'd had for years, Margaret teasing him for refusing to upgrade. His fingers hovered over the keypad. "It's nearly midnight," Robert interjected. "You can't call now." "Convenient," John muttered, but he pocketed the phone. He turned his attention back to Robert. "Why are you involved in this? What's really happening?" Robert ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture John recognized from when he was a teenager trying to explain a dented fender or failed exam. "Uncle John, the foundation is in trouble. There are discrepancies in the accounts. Aunt Margaret discovered them a few months ago." "Discrepancies," John repeated flatly. "Missing funds, significant amounts." Robert's gaze flicked to Lisa, then back. "Aunt Margaret has been trying to fix it quietly, protect the foundation's reputation. That's why she opened the separate account, to replace the money while she figured out who was responsible." The explanation sounded plausible, but something didn't sit right. "And she didn't tell me because—" "She didn't want to worry you. You've been having heart problems. I had one irregular checkup 6 months ago," John cut in. "Hardly reason to keep me in the dark about our life savings." Lisa made a sound of impatience. "This is getting us nowhere." "The fact remains, Mrs. Harmon has been moving money. The foundation is being investigated, and Mr. Harmon here is the only one with access to all the accounts." The implication hung in the air, heavy as a summer storm. John felt a cold weight settle in his stomach as he understood. "You're setting me up." The words came out barely above a whisper, "making it look like I'm the one who took the money." "Uncle John, no one's saying that. Aren't you?" John cut him off. "The forged letter, the fake recording, breaking into my house to plant evidence. It's all to frame me." The betrayal cut deeper coming from Robert, the boy he'd loved like a son. Lisa checked her watch, her composure now tinged with irritation. "We don't have time for this. The transfer has to happen tonight." Robert shot her a warning look, but it was too late. John had heard enough to confirm his suspicions. "What transfer?" he demanded. Neither answered. The silence in the kitchen stretched, broken only by the steady drip of syrup from the counter where peach juice had splashed. John made a decision. He reached for his phone again, this time to call the police. Lisa moved with surprising speed, knocking the phone from his hand. It skittered across the floor, disappearing under the refrigerator. "We can't let you do that." "This has gone too far," Robert said, voice strained. "We need to tell him." Tell me what? John felt suddenly very old, very tired. Where is my wife? Where is Margaret? Robert's face crumpled. For a moment, he looked like the 10-year-old boy who'd shown up on their doorstep the night his parents announced their divorce. I don't know. She was supposed to meet me yesterday. She never showed. The admission hit John like a physical blow. He staggered back against the counter, knocking over a mug that shattered on the floor, adding to the mess of broken glass and fruit. You don't know? His voice rose, panic edging in where calm had prevailed. How long has she been missing? 36 hours, Lisa answered, when Robert seemed unable to. We thought she might have told you something, left some indication. The room seemed to tilt. John grabbed the counter to steady himself. Margaret missing, money disappearing. A carefully orchestrated attempt to implicate him. And his nephew, somehow caught in the middle. We need to call the police, John insisted. We can't. Lisa's voice hardened. Not yet. There's too much at stake. More than my wife's life? John's control finally broke, years of measured calm shattering like the glass at his feet. Whatever scheme you're running, whatever money you're stealing, none of it matters if Margaret is in danger. Robert stepped between them as Lisa's face darkened. Uncle John, please, there are people involved. Powerful people. If we go to the police now, it could make things worse for Aunt Margaret. John looked at his nephew, really looked at him, the nervous hands, the haunted eyes, the slight tremor in his voice. Robert was scared, not just worried, but terrified. What have you gotten mixed up in, Bobby? John asked quietly, using the childhood nickname. Before Robert could answer, the lights went out, plunging the kitchen into darkness. A moment later, the distant sound of car doors slamming came from the street. They're here, Lisa whispered, urgency replacing her earlier confidence. We need to go, now. Who's here? John demanded, but Robert was already pulling him toward the back door. People who want what Margaret found, his nephew said grimly. People who'll do anything to get it. Has it come to this? Running from my own home? The thought brought a surge of despair so intense it nearly buckled John's knees. Decades of building a life, a home, a reputation, all crumbling in a single night. In the darkness, his hand found the familiar shape of the drawer where he kept a small flashlight. Beside it lay something else, the wrench he'd used to fix the sink last week. His fingers closed around the solid weight of it, a tool that had served him well for over 40 years. Uncle John, we have to move, Robert urged. Outside, car doors slammed shut. Footsteps approached the house. John tucked the wrench into his pocket. Whatever was happening, whoever was coming, one thing was clear. Finding Margaret was all that mattered now. Everything else, the money, the foundation, even his own reputation, was secondary. Tell me everything, he said, following Robert toward the back door. And this time, no more lies. The night air hit John's face as Robert pulled him through the back door and across the yard. Decades of muscle memory guided him past Margaret's rose bushes and through the gap in the fence, a shortcut to the alley that neighborhood kids had been using since before Robert was born. My truck's 2 blocks over, Robert whispered, leading John along the darkened alley. I parked away from the house in case... In case what? John pressed, his breath coming harder than he liked to admit. Time to come clean, Bobby. They paused at the alley's end, checking for signs of pursuit. The distant sound of breaking glass suggested the visitors hadn't come for polite conversation. The foundation, Robert began, voice low. It started as a way to help kids learn trades, but someone saw an opportunity. They approached Aunt Margaret about 8 months ago, wanted to use the accounts to move money. Money laundering, John supplied, the pieces clicking into place. Through our foundation. Robert nodded. She refused, of course, but they didn't take no for an answer. Started small, threatening calls, minor vandalism at the office. They continued moving, staying in shadows, two figures making their way through the quiet suburban streets where John had lived for 4 decades. The familiarity of it all, the Jensen's maple tree, the crooked streetlight by the Thompson place, contrasted sharply with the surreal situation. Margaret never said a word, John said, the realization bringing fresh pain. His wife had been carrying this burden alone. She didn't want you involved, said you'd just recovered from that heart scare. Robert glanced back. When they escalated to direct threats against you both, she decided to gather evidence. Started documenting everything, following money trails. They reached a battered pickup truck, not Robert's usual vehicle. John's mechanical eye noted the mismatched panel on the driver's side, the slightly uneven stance suggesting worn shocks. Borrowed it, Robert explained, catching John's assessment. My car might be watched. Inside the truck, Robert pulled a manila envelope from beneath the seat and handed it to John. 3 days ago, Aunt Margaret called me. Said she'd found something big. Not just about the foundation, but about Judge Holloway and Commissioner Beck. John's eyebrows rose. The most powerful men in the county. What did she find? She wouldn't say over the phone. Asked me to meet her at the lake house to go through it together. Robert started the engine, the old truck grumbling to life. She never showed. When I went to check your house, it was empty. Then Lisa contacted me, said people were looking for Margaret's evidence. John opened the envelope with fingers that felt stiff and clumsy. Inside were bank statements, photocopies of checks with signatures that looked deliberately similar to his own, and documents from the foundation with forgeries of his handwriting authorizing large transfers. They're setting me up to take the fall, he said quietly. At the thoroughness of it was almost impressive. If Margaret disappears and this evidence surfaces, you'd go down for embezzlement and possibly worse, Robert confirmed, pulling away from the curb. That's why we can't go to the police yet. Beck's got half the department in his pocket. The headlights of an approaching car prompted Robert to turn down a side street. John studied his nephew's profile, trying to reconcile the boy who'd cried over a caught fish with the man now driving them away from what felt increasingly like a crime scene. And Lisa? Where does she fit in? Robert's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She works for Beck, was planted in the foundation to keep tabs on things. But when Margaret disappeared, he hesitated. Lisa reached out to me, said things had gone too far, that Beck's people were talking about making Margaret's disappearance permanent. Yet she was in our house tonight stealing documents. Playing both sides, Robert admitted. Helping us find Margaret while covering herself with Beck. It's complicated. John snorted. Seems that word keeps coming up. He turned his attention back to the documents, mechanic's eyes catching details others might miss. These transfer authorizations, the signatures are good forgeries, but the pressure points are wrong. What do you mean? When I sign my name, I press harder at certain points. It's unconscious, but consistent. John tapped a document. Whoever did these forgeries didn't know that. A forensic examiner would spot it immediately. For the first time that night, a faint smile crossed Robert's face. That's exactly what Aunt Margaret said. She'd been collecting examples, building a case. The truck turned onto the highway leading out of town, heading north toward the lake where the Harmons kept a small vacation cabin. John stared out at the familiar landscape, now transformed by darkness and circumstance. His mind, working through decades of mechanical puzzles, had prepared him for. "The lake house," he said suddenly. "If she found something important, that's where she'd secure it." Robert nodded. "That's what I thought too. I checked the obvious places. The safe, the loose floorboard in the bedroom." "Too obvious," John murmured. "Margaret's smarter than that." The miles passed in silence, John sifting through memories of their life together, looking for clues. Margaret had always been the organized one, the planner. If she'd hidden something, she'd have left a way for him to find it. "That recording Lisa played," John said finally. "It wasn't Margaret's voice, but there was something familiar about it, the cadence, certain phrases." "They probably pieced it together from foundation videos," Robert suggested. "Aunt Margaret gives those quarterly presentations." John shook his head. No, it was something else. He closed his eyes, replaying the recording in his mind. Then it hit him. It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. The pauses, the emphasis patterns. "What are you thinking?" "It's a code," John said, certainty growing. "Your aunt and I used to play word games when we were first married. Long drives, power outages. We developed this system where the pauses between words mattered more than the words themselves." Robert glanced at him. "You think she hid a message in a recording she knew they'd make? If she suspected they were setting me up, forcing her to record a fake confession would be part of it." John's mind raced. She'd find a way to leave a clue. "Did Lisa give you a copy of that recording?" Robert shook his head. "But I can probably get one. Lisa's still playing both sides, and she's scared. Leverage that." The lake house appeared ahead, a dark silhouette against the starlit water. John felt a strange calm settling over him. For hours, he'd been reacting to the letter, to Lisa's intrusion, to Robert's revelations. Now, finally, he was acting. "We need that recording," he said firmly, "and we need to search the lake house again, not for documents, but for a message Margaret would leave specifically for me." Robert parked some distance from the cabin, killing the headlights before they approached. "What if we're wrong? What if she's not leaving clues, but actually in danger?" The question hit John like a physical blow. The possibility that Margaret might be hurt, might be. He couldn't complete the thought. "Then we find her," he said, his voice harder than Robert had likely ever heard it. "And God help anyone who's harmed her." They approached the cabin cautiously. It appeared undisturbed, exactly as it had been when they'd closed it up after Labor Day. John retrieved the spare key from its hiding place beneath a false rock Margaret had bought specifically because it looked too fake to be fake. Inside, the familiar scent of pine and old books brought a wave of memories. Summer evenings on the porch, winter weekends by the fireplace, Margaret's laughter echoing across the lake. 43 years of marriage contained in this small space, almost as much as in their primary home. "We need light, but carefully," John said, finding an old flashlight in the kitchen drawer. "Check windows first. Make sure we're not visible from outside." As Robert secured the cabin, John moved through the space, seeing it with new eyes. Not as a vacation home filled with comfortable familiarity, but as a potential vault for secrets. Margaret would have hidden something important somewhere meaningful, somewhere only he would think to look. His flashlight beam caught the bookshelf, where they kept old photo albums and dog-eared paperbacks. On the middle shelf sat the wooden music box he'd given Margaret on their 5th anniversary. Heart pounding, John lifted it carefully, turning it over to wind the mechanism. The tinkling melody filled the cabin. Moon River, their wedding song. As it played, John examined the box more closely, fingers finding the hidden catch he'd built into it decades ago. A secret compartment that even Robert wouldn't know about. Inside lay a single USB drive and a handwritten note in Margaret's unmistakable script. "John, if you're reading this, I'm in trouble. Everything you need is here. Trust only yourself. I love you. Always. M." After 43 years, he knew her handwriting as well as his own. This wasn't forged. This was real. "Found something?" Robert asked, returning from checking the windows. John pocketed the USB drive, but showed him the note. "We need a computer." For the first time since this ordeal began, John felt the stirring of hope. Margaret was alive. She'd left him the tools to find her, and after a lifetime of fixing things others thought beyond repair, John Harmon wasn't about to fail at the most important repair job of his life. Trust shattered your world. Comment your story, like for strength, follow for John's fight for justice. Will he find Margaret in time? Dawn crept over the lake, painting the water with strokes of pink and gold. John sat on the cabin's porch. Robert's laptop open before him, the contents of Margaret's USB drive illuminating his weathered face. He hadn't slept. Couldn't sleep, not with what he'd discovered. The drive contained meticulous records, bank statements, photographs, recorded conversations. Margaret had documented everything. Commissioner Beck and Judge Holloway using the foundation to launder money from county development projects. Shell companies awarded inflated contracts, funds siphoned through the foundation's accounts, all designed to look like John's doing if anyone started asking questions. Most damning was a video Margaret had secretly recorded. Beck discussing what would happen if she didn't cooperate. "Accidents happen to people their age," he'd said, casual as discussing the weather. "Heart attacks, falls, no one questions it." The final file was a video message from Margaret herself, recorded 3 days ago in this very cabin. "John," she'd said, her familiar face filling the screen, eyes tired but determined. "If you're watching this, I couldn't reach you in time. They're moving faster than I anticipated." She'd explained her investigation, her discovery that Lisa was Beck's plant, her decision to gather evidence before coming forward. "I've secured copies of everything with our lawyer in Asheville," she continued. "Time-locked instructions. If anything happens to me, it all goes to the FBI on Friday morning." She'd paused, emotion briefly overtaking her composure. "Find me before then, John. I'm at the Riverview Hotel in room 412, under the name we used on our honeymoon." A sad smile. "I love you. Always have." The video ended there. Today was Thursday. They had less than 24 hours. Robert emerged from the cabin, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. "Any sleep?" he asked, passing one to John. "No." John took the coffee, its warmth a small comfort against the morning chill. "We need to get to the Riverview. Margaret's waiting for us." Robert frowned. "Uncle John, that video's 3 days old. If she was there—" "She's there." John cut him off, unwilling to consider alternatives. "Your aunt's smart. She'd have planned for delays. Even if she is, Beck's people will be watching the hotel." Robert sat heavily in the adjacent chair. "We need help." John considered their options. The local police were compromised. The FBI wouldn't move fast enough. Friends might unwittingly lead Beck right to them. "There's one person," John said finally. "Carl Gunderson." Robert's eyebrows rose. "The reporter? The one always investigating county corruption?" John nodded. "Margaret's been feeding him information for years. Anonymous tips about county contract irregularities." At Robert's surprised look, he smiled faintly. "Your aunt has always hated bullies, even ones with fancy titles." You think he'll help without running the story immediately? I think he'll help because of the story. John drained his coffee. But we'll need a secure way to contact him, and we'll need to move fast. The plan came together as the sun climbed higher. Robert would approach Gunderson under pretense of a routine foundation update, something he'd done before as the organization's legal advisor. Meanwhile, John would scope out the Riverview, an old hotel in the city's historic district. They parted at the bus station, John boarding a bus to the city while Robert took the truck. Safer to travel separately, they'd agreed. As the bus pulled away, John watched his nephew's figure recede, still not entirely certain of Robert's loyalties, but out of options. The Riverview Hotel stood on the banks of the river that gave the city its name, a once grand establishment now slightly faded but maintaining its dignity. Not unlike John himself, he thought wryly. He entered through a side door, cap pulled low, just another elderly man no one would look at twice. The lobby featured the same red carpet and brass fixtures he remembered from a weekend getaway for their 40th anniversary. The young woman at the reception desk barely glanced up as he crossed to the elevator's 4th floor. Room 412. John's heart pounded as the elevator climbed, each floor bringing him closer to Margaret, or to the confirmation of his worst fears. The hallway stretched before him, numbered doors on either side. 408, 410, 412. John paused, listening. No sounds from within. He knocked softly. Nothing. He knocked again. A pattern he and Margaret had used when the kids were sleeping. 3 quick taps, pause, 2 more. The lock clicked. The door opened a crack, then wider. Margaret stood before him, hair disheveled, eyes widening in recognition. John? For a moment, neither moved. Then they were in each other's arms, Margaret's familiar lavender scent surrounding him, her body solid and real against his. "I knew you'd figure it out," she whispered against his shoulder. "I knew you'd come." John held her tightly, relief washing through him in waves so powerful he felt lightheaded. "Are you all right? Have they hurt you?" She pulled back, allowing him to see her fully. A bruise shadowed her left cheek, but her eyes were clear and determined. "I'm fine. Had a run-in with Lisa when she realized I was onto her, but nothing serious." Inside the hotel room, Margaret had created a command center of sorts. Laptop open, papers organized in neat piles, a burner phone on the nightstand, always the organizer, even in crisis. "I've been monitoring their movements," she explained, indicating the laptop. "Beck's getting desperate. The county audit is next week, and he needs the foundation transfers completed before then." John filled her in quickly. The forged letter, Lisa's break-in, Robert's involvement, their discovery of the USB drive. Margaret listened intently, her expression darkening at the mention of their nephew. "Robert's been playing both sides," she said when John finished. "He came to me a month ago, admitted Beck had pressured him into legal work for some of the shell companies. Said he wanted out. Do you believe him?" Margaret's gaze was steady. "I want to. He's family, but I've learned to be cautious." A soft knock at the door tensed them both. 3 quick taps, pause, 2 more. "That's how you knocked," Margaret whispered. John moved to the door, positioning himself to block any entry. "Who is it?" "It's me, Uncle John." Robert's voice, low and urgent. "I've got Gunderson with me." John glanced at Margaret, who nodded cautiously. He opened the door. Robert entered, followed by a man John recognized from local news broadcasts, Carl Gunderson, the investigative reporter known for his dogged pursuit of corruption stories. In his mid-50s, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, Gunderson looked exactly like the kind of man who wouldn't let go once he had his teeth in a story. "Mrs. Harmon," he said, nodding to Margaret, "your husband and nephew have shared quite a tale." "All true," Margaret replied, "and I have the evidence to prove it." "So I see." Gunderson gestured to the organized piles of documents. "May I?" As Gunderson reviewed the evidence, John took Margaret's hand, holding it tightly. The simple contact grounded him, reminding him what truly mattered amid all the chaos. "This is explosive," Gunderson said finally, looking up from a particularly damning set of photographs showing Beck accepting an envelope from a developer whose contract had tripled in value the following week. "But you understand my publishing this puts you both at risk." "We're already at risk," John replied. "But if this goes public, Beck loses his leverage. Too many eyes watching." Gunderson nodded thoughtfully. "I can have the initial story ready for tomorrow's paper. Digital version goes live at midnight." "That's cutting it close," Robert interjected. "Beck's people are moving tonight. They know something's up after the house incident." The tension in the room ratcheted higher. John felt Margaret's hand tighten in his. "Then we move first," she said with quiet determination. "We take everything to FBI agent Simmons. She's been investigating Beck for months. With this evidence and Gunderson's story breaking simultaneously, Beck and Holloway won't know which way to turn," Gunderson finished, a predatory gleam in his eye. "I like it." The plan solidified. Gunderson would prepare his story while helping them reach Agent Simmons securely. The Harmons would remain at the Riverview until the handoff was complete. As Robert and Gunderson prepared to leave with copies of the evidence, John pulled his nephew aside. "I'm still not sure where you stand in all this," he said quietly, "but I'm trusting you now because we have no choice." Robert met his gaze directly. "I made mistakes, Uncle John. Got in too deep before I realized what Beck was really doing. But I'm trying to make it right." John studied the face so like his sister's, the same determined set of the jaw, the same inability to hide emotion in the eyes. "Your aunt sees the good in you. I hope she's right." After they left, John returned to Margaret's side. In the quiet of the hotel room, with the afternoon sun slanting through partially closed blinds, he finally asked the question he'd been holding back. "Why didn't you tell me from the beginning? We've never had secrets." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "They threatened you specifically, John. Said they'd make it look like a heart attack." Her voice caught. "After your scare last spring, I couldn't risk it. Thought I could handle it myself." John cupped her bruised cheek gently. 43 years, Margaret. We handle things together." She leaned into his touch. "I know. I should have trusted that. Trusted us." A sharp knock at the door jolted them both. Not Robert's pattern. Not anyone they were expecting. "Mr. and Mrs. Harmon?" An unfamiliar voice. "Hotel security. We need you to open the door." John and Margaret exchanged glances. The hotel hadn't called the room. No one knew they were registered under their honeymoon alias. Beck's people had found them. "Bathroom, now." John's whisper was urgent but controlled as he guided Margaret toward the back of the hotel room. Decades of marriage made lengthy explanations unnecessary. She understood immediately, grabbing her phone and the most crucial evidence folder as she moved. The knock came again, more insistent. "Security! Open up or we're coming in." John's mind raced through options, evaluating and discarding them with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to diagnosing engine troubles. The bathroom had no exit. The window overlooked a 4-story drop to concrete. They were trapped. Unless... "Remember Gatlinburg?" he murmured to Margaret as they closed the bathroom door. The hotel fire? Her eyes widened in recognition. 20 years ago, they'd escaped a hotel fire by crossing to the adjacent room's balcony when evacuation routes were blocked. John had insisted on booking adjoining rooms ever since, a quirk Margaret had lovingly teased him about, calling it his escape hatch obsession. Room 412 had a narrow balcony. So would 414. The main door splintered under force, not hotel security, but men with crowbars. Margaret was already sliding the bathroom window open, the evening air rushing in as John helped her through. "Careful," he warned, steadying her as she stepped onto the narrow concrete ledge that ran beneath the windows. At 65, Margaret moved with the deliberate grace of a woman who'd spent decades tending gardens and chasing grandchildren, cautious but confident. John followed, closing the window behind them just as the bathroom door rattled. The ledge was barely 8 inches wide, meant for architecture rather than escape routes. 4 stories below, the river glinted in the setting sun, beautiful and deadly. "Room 414, John directed, his voice low as they inched along the ledge. Margaret led, one hand trailing the rough brick wall for balance. John followed, focusing on each movement, refusing to acknowledge the height or his treacherous heart, which had picked this moment to remind him of his age. They reached the next window, closed but unlatched, thank God. Margaret eased it open, the sound masked by shouts from their room as Beck's men discovered their quarry missing. The adjoining room was empty, beds neatly made, curtains drawn. They slipped inside, closing the window behind them. "The evidence," Margaret whispered, clutching the folder she'd grabbed. "It's not enough. The rest is about to be discovered," John finished, moving to the door. "We need to go, now." They entered the hallway, walking briskly but not running. Just an elderly couple heading out for dinner. Nothing suspicious. The elevator dinged at the far end, disgorging 2 burly men in dark suits who scanned the corridor with predatory focus. John pulled Margaret into the stairwell before they were spotted. "Down," he directed, though his knees protested at the thought of 4 flights. Margaret squeezed his hand in understanding. A brief moment of connection amid the chaos. They descended as quickly as John's joints allowed, pausing at the second-floor landing when voices echoed from below. More of Beck's men coming up. "The service corridor," Margaret suggested, pushing through the exit door onto the second floor. The hallway stretched before them, red carpet muffling their footsteps, as they sought the staff access door she'd noted during her days of surveillance. A housekeeper's cart provided momentary cover as 2 more men exited the elevator, radioing updates. John caught fragments. "Not in the room. Check all exits. Beck wants them alive." The service door required a keycard. John pulled out his wallet, extracting an old Navy ID that he'd kept for sentimental reasons. Years of mechanical tinkering had taught him that most electronic locks had weaknesses. This one yielded to a technique he'd learned from a locksmith who'd frequented his shop. The service corridor was dimly lit and smelled of industrial cleaning products. They moved quickly past linen storage and maintenance rooms, following signs to the loading dock. "John!" Margaret's voice stopped him. She pointed to a wall-mounted house phone. "We need help." He nodded, understanding immediately. Margaret dialed, speaking rapidly, when the call connected. "Carl, it's Margaret Harmon. Beck's men found us at the Riverview. We're trying to reach the loading dock." She listened briefly. 10 minutes, we'll try." She hung up, turning to John. "Gunderson and Agent Simmons are 8 minutes out. They'll meet us at the Riverwalk behind the hotel if we can get there." A crash behind them, the service door slamming open, ended further discussion. They ran, John ignoring the protests of his knees, Margaret leading the way through the labyrinthine back corridors of the old hotel. The loading dock door was chained shut. Fire code violation, John noted absently, but a smaller personnel door stood ajar, evening air beckoning beyond. They slipped through, emerging into the hotel's rear service area where delivery trucks usually parked. Shouts from behind spurred them toward the Riverwalk, a brick-paved pedestrian path that ran along the waterfront behind the city's historic district. Thursday evening meant tourists and locals alike strolling, dining at outdoor cafes, listening to the street musicians who gathered near the old bridge. "Witnesses," John panted as they joined the flow of pedestrians. "They won't try anything with this many people." Margaret's hand found his, clutching with the desperation of someone who understood the danger wasn't past. "The marina," she said between breaths. "Gunderson will meet us by the tour boat dock." They moved with the crowd, two more seniors enjoying an evening stroll, though John's pulse hammered in his ears and Margaret's knuckles were white around the evidence folder. Behind them, Beck's men had emerged onto the Riverwalk, trying to blend in, but betrayed by their searching gazes and the barely concealed earpieces. The marina came into view, sailboats and motorboats bobbing gently in their slips, the tour boat dock just ahead, where a Mississippi-style paddle-wheeler took tourists on sunset cruises. No sign of Gunderson or the FBI agent. "There," Margaret nodded toward a newspaper vendor near the dock. "The blue cap." John spotted him. Gunderson in disguise, casually selling papers while watching the river walk. Their eyes met briefly, and the reporter gave an almost imperceptible nod toward the tour boat, where passengers were boarding for the evening cruise. "Tickets?" asked the board attendant as they approached the gangplank. "Check the reservations," John replied steadily. "Harmon, party of 2. The attendant glanced at his list. "Nothing under—" "They're with me," interrupted a woman who appeared beside them, mid-40s, sharp eyes, casual clothes that couldn't quite disguise her professional bearing. "Agent Simmons," she murmured as she guided them aboard. "Let's get you somewhere secure." The boat's cabin offered relative privacy, passengers gathering on the open upper deck for better views. Simmons led them to a corner table as the engines rumbled to life and the paddle wheeler began moving away from the dock. "Perfect timing," she said, surveying the river walk where Beck's men had realized too late what was happening. One made a move toward the gangplank, but the boat was already pulling away, the gap too wide to jump. "The evidence," Simmons continued, "all business now that immediate danger had passed." Margaret placed the folder on the table. "This is only part of it. The rest was in the hotel room." "Gunderson has copies," Simmons reassured her, "and Robert provided additional documentation this afternoon." John studied the FBI agent's face. "You've been building a case against Beck for some time." Simmons nodded. 2 years. But we needed someone on the inside of the foundation to make it stick. When Mrs. Harmon contacted us, you let her put herself at risk," John finished, an edge to his voice. "John," Margaret placed her hand on his, "it was my choice. I knew what I was doing." The boat cruised downriver, city lights twinkling on shore. In the safety of the cabin, with an FBI agent across from them and Beck's men left fuming on the dock, John finally allowed himself to consider the magnitude of what they'd uncovered and what they'd nearly lost. "Commissioner Beck and Judge Holloway will be arrested tonight," Simmons explained, reviewing the evidence Margaret had brought. "We have enough here, combined with our existing investigation, to move immediately." "And Lisa?" Margaret asked. "Being picked up as we speak, along with several others. Your nephew Robert has been cooperating since this afternoon, provided valuable testimony in exchange for consideration." John absorbed this. Emotions conflicted. Robert had made poor choices, but had ultimately helped them when it mattered. Family was complicated that way. "What happens now?" he asked, suddenly feeling every one of his 68 years. The adrenaline was fading, leaving bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. "Now," said Simmons, "you and Mrs. Harmon give your formal statements. Then you go home." Home. The word hit John with unexpected force. Their house might still be monitored, might even have been searched more thoroughly after their escape. But it was still home. The place he'd built with his own hands, where he and Margaret had raised their children, welcomed grandchildren, built a life. "Gunderson's story breaks at midnight," Simmons continued. "By morning, everyone in the county will know what Beck and Holloway have been doing, and how you two helped bring them down." Margaret's hand found John's under the table, a gesture so familiar it made his throat tight with emotion. They'd weathered this storm together, as they had every challenge in 43 years of marriage. The boat turned, beginning its return journey to the dock where Simmons had arranged for secure transport to the FBI field office. Through the window, John could see the city skyline, the old clock tower, the bridge where he'd proposed to Margaret all those years ago. "We did it," Margaret whispered, following his gaze. John squeezed her hand in response. They had done it. Faced down corruption, overcome betrayal, protected what mattered. Not bad for a retired mechanic and a former school teacher who society often dismissed as past their prime. Not bad at all. 2 weeks later, John eased himself into the porch swing, coffee mug warming his hands against the autumn chill. The newspaper lay folded on the small table beside him. Another headline about the Beck-Holloway scandal and the ongoing investigation that had now expanded to include 3 neighboring counties. The front door opened as Margaret stepped out, wrapped in the quilted shawl their daughter had made last Christmas. Without a word, she settled beside him on the swing, their bodies finding the familiar rhythm they'd perfected over decades. "Robert called," she said after a comfortable silence. "The DA's office confirmed his plea deal, community service and probation, in exchange for his testimony." John nodded, mixed emotions stirring. His nephew had made poor choices, but had ultimately helped when it mattered most. He's young enough to rebuild. Speaking of rebuilding, Margaret gestured toward the front yard, where the damage from Beck's men had been repaired. New rose bushes planted, the broken window replaced, the front door reinforced. Small changes, but meaningful. This was their home, and they had reclaimed it. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind. FBI interviews, newspaper stories, calls from friends and family who'd seen their names in the headlines. The foundation was under temporary management, while an audit untangled legitimate operations from Beck's money laundering scheme. Through it all, John and Margaret had faced each challenge together, their partnership stronger for having been tested. "Gunderson's producer called again," Margaret said, a hint of amusement in her voice. "They really want us for that morning show interview." John groaned. "Haven't we had enough attention?" She patted his knee affectionately. "The senior citizens who busted City Hall angle is too good to resist, apparently. Is that how they see us? Just seniors?" There was no bitterness in the question, merely curiosity. Margaret considered this. "They're missing the point. It wasn't about age. It was about knowing who we are, what we value." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "About trusting what we've built." Trust. The word resonated. 2 weeks ago, John had discovered what felt like betrayal in every corner of his life. The forged letter, Robert's involvement, Lisa's deception. Yet beneath it all had been Margaret's unwavering trust in him, her certainty that he would understand the clues she'd left, that he would find her, that together they would set things right. Their granddaughter's car pulled into the driveway, Emily waving enthusiastically from behind the wheel. Sunday dinner, another tradition restored. Last week had been awkward, with too many unasked questions hanging in the air. This week would be better. "I fixed her car yesterday," John said, watching Emily unload grocery bags from the trunk. "Spark plug issue. Showed her how to recognize the symptoms next time." Margaret smiled, passing on the knowledge. "Someone has to," he replied. "All that experience has to count for something." Their daughter's car arrived next, then their son's family. Soon the house would be filled with voices, laughter, the controlled chaos of family gathering. Life continuing, stronger, for having almost been lost. John thought about the moment in the hotel room when he'd heard Margaret's voice on that recording, when he'd understood she was leaving him clues rather than abandoning him. The leap of faith it had taken to trust that, despite all evidence to the contrary, the reward of finding her, of standing together against those who thought them easy targets because of their age. "We should take the boat out next weekend," he suggested suddenly, "before it gets too cold, just you and me." Margaret's eyes met his, understanding the deeper meaning behind the simple suggestion. Time alone, away from the aftermath of everything they'd been through, space to rediscover the rhythm of their life together. "I'd like that," she said softly. Emily bounded up the porch steps, grocery bags in hand, dark hair escaping her ponytail, so like Margaret at that age it sometimes caught John's breath. "Grandpa! Grandma! I brought everything for apple pie. Can you show me the secret to your crust again?" Her enthusiasm was infectious, untouched by the shadows that had briefly darkened their lives. "Of course, sweet pea." Margaret rose, making room for Emily on the swing beside John. "Your grandfather's the real expert, though. Those mechanics' hands have the perfect touch for pastry." John chuckled. "You need cold butter and a light touch, like most worthwhile things in life." As Emily settled beside him, peppering him with questions about pie crust and spark plugs, and the newspaper headlines she'd been following, John felt a profound sense of rightness settle over him. This was his legacy, not just the house he'd built or the business he'd run, but these moments of connection, the knowledge shared, the trust earned, the love given freely. Margaret caught his eye over Emily's animated gestures, a lifetime of understanding passing between them in a single glance. They had weathered this storm as they had all others, together. The betrayal that had threatened to shatter their world had instead revealed its strength, like a stress test proving structural integrity. Later, with the house full of family and the kitchen warm with cooking smells, John found a quiet moment to slip away to the den. The documents were locked safely away now, copies with the FBI, the originals returned to their rightful places. But the photographs still stood on the shelf. Last Christmas, all of them together, Margaret's hand on his shoulder. He picked it up, thumb tracing the familiar faces. Not just a picture anymore, but a testament. To family, to resilience, to the quiet strength that comes from building a life of purpose and integrity. Margaret appeared in the doorway, a knowing look on her face. "Dinner's almost ready." John set the photo back in its place of honor. "I was just thinking about how close we came to losing it all," she finished for him. He shook his head. "About how much we have that can never be taken away." Margaret crossed the room, taking his hand in hers. The same hands that had exchanged rings 43 years ago, that had worked and built and comforted and healed, that had found each other even in their darkest moment. "Come on, mechanic," she said softly. "Your family's waiting." Together, They returned to the noise and warmth of the kitchen, to the life they'd built, to the future still unfolding before them, older now, perhaps, but wiser too, and infinitely stronger than anyone had given them credit for. Folks, you've been there, haven't you? Sitting in a quiet room with a letter, a phone call, a discovery that turns your world sideways. That moment when trust, built over decades of good mornings and shared suppers, suddenly splinters like old wood under too much weight. You know that hollow feeling that started in John's chest when evidence of betrayal first appeared. The tears that come without permission, salt mixing with the familiar sense of home that suddenly feel like they belong to someone else's life. We've all weathered those storms, haven't we? The ones that roll in after 60-some years of living, threatening to wash away what we've built. Ain't fair, is it, when the very people who should cherish your wisdom try to use your age against you? Those moments when your heart feels too worn and weary to fight another battle. When the kitchen where you've laughed and loved becomes a place of broken sobs, and the photographs on your walls seem to mock what used to be. Trust breaks, tears fall, the clock ticks on, indifferent to your pain. But here's what I've learned, darlin', what John's journey reminds us all. Those hands that tremble with hurt are the same ones that built houses, fixed engines, raised children. The mind they thought too old to notice is sharper for having seen patterns repeat across decades. There's power in those crow's feet earned from years of sunshine, in the memory that stretches back further than those who would deceive you can imagine. When John noticed that signature wasn't quite right, it wasn't just suspicion. It was wisdom that can only come from a lifetime of paying attention. Remember the porch swing where you've watched seasons change, the creak of wood that knows your weight, the rhythm of your thoughts. That's where healing begins. Under starlight that's witnessed generations come and go, with the distant song of crickets marking time's passage. That's where you sit when the tears have dried enough to think clearly, when hands that once trembled with grief now steady around a warm mug. When betrayal's sharp edges begin to dull, not because the hurt was any less real, but because you are more than what was done to you. You'll stand again. You'll reclaim what matters, not just possessions or positions, but the dignity that comes from knowing your own worth isn't diminished by another's actions. The legacy you've built isn't so easily destroyed. Like John finding his way back to what matters, you'll discover that love, real love, leaves breadcrumbs even through the darkest forests of deceit. One last tear might fall, not from pain, but from the profound relief of coming home to yourself again, stronger at the broken places, wiser for having walked through fire,